So we have the total dismemberment of the steel structure. This is important. This is after it comes down. What we see is a pile about 4 or 6 stories tall. That means we have a 47-story moment-resisting steel frame structure, as Steve was describing the properties of reduced like a house of cards to this pile. That means every column was separated, dismembered from every beam. Normal structures fall. You can see the mangled building certainly at the bottom, but the steel or concrete, in this case, members are not completely dismembered from each other. Do we have witnesses that hear sounds of explosions? Here's Kevin McPadden, former Air Force medic, on the scene.
And then it was like another 2-3 seconds, you heard explosions. Like, boom! It's like a distinct sound. It's not like when in compression, like boom, 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 like floors that were dropping and collapsing. This was boom, and like you felt a rumble in the ground, like almost like you wanted to grab onto something. To me, I knew that was an explosion. There was no doubt in my mind.
There are no explosions in any of the final reports from NIST, and yet, as we'll see, there's a lot more, including at Building 7, this witness.
I'm going to call in Bill Rosati. He was here when it all happened. He saw it for himself. Bill, if you can just tell us what you saw, what you heard.
I was standing like 2 blocks away, and all of a sudden I just seen a big flash, and then I seen the building coming down, and I just seen people just running everywhere. Chaos.
When we got to the 8th floor, I started walking to one.
And this gentleman, Barry Jennings, who was working in the building, and the building had been evacuated after the towers were hit by the planes, but before they came down. This is Barry Jennings working with the Department of Housing. He and Mayor Giuliani's attorney, Michael Hess, went back into the building, not realizing what had happened here. This is their experience.
When we got to the 8th floor, I started walking to one side of the building. That side of the building was gone. The first explosion I heard when I was on the stairwell landing, when we made it down to the 6th floor. Then we made it back to the 8th floor. I heard some more explosions.
What's the sound?
Like a boom, like an explosion.
More than one?
Yes. We started walking down the stairs. We made it to the 8th floor. Big explosion. Blew us back into the 8th floor. When we get outside, a police officer comes to me and says, "You have to run. We have more information of bombs, so you have to run."
And this explosion heard by first responders in the afternoon of 9/11 adjacent to Building 7.
Yeah, here's one of the guys who can tell you I'm okay, all right? Here, hold on. You want to call your mother or something?
No explosions in any of the official reports, though. Do we have enormous pyroclastic-like clouds of pulverized concrete? In fact, we're suggested by the National Fire Protection Association, NFA 921, to look for large volumes of gas and the large amount of heat released in chemical explosions, causing rapidly expanding plumes of hot gases, as we see here racing away from Building 7 at 35 miles an hour in every direction from the collapse of that building. Much more heat expanding these plumes, cauliflower-shaped plumes, from these rapidly expanding gases, much more heat than we saw in those small fires in Building 7. Do we have evidence of chemical cutter charges or thermite or explosives? Well, Stephen Jones has asked me to convey to you his condolences. He's come down with a condition where laryngitis. And so we're going to be looking at the results of some of his work and others. He has 26 years of experience as a nuclear physicist and has been a researcher early on in the 9/11 Truth Movement and has pointed us to the official report, FEMA, the Appendix C, from the Building Performance Assessment Team report, May 2002, the report that came out early on about Building 7. Appendix C documents some very interesting phenomena here, never before observed in building fires: eutectic reactions, intergranular melting, A solid steel girder turning to Swiss cheese, as you see here. Gaping holes larger than a silver dollar. And razor thinness from these eutectic reactions. Very carefully documented, as you see here. This is not accomplished by normal office fires. We're talking a rapid oxidation, sulfidation, and melting of steel. Liquid iron, that's liquid molten iron, takes 2,800 degrees Fahrenheit to melt iron. These office fires were maybe 600 degrees, possibly 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit, less than a third or a quarter of that required to perform this attack on the steel, which is so carefully documented in this meticulous report that NIST, when they took over the investigation in 2002, threw out and did not appear in their final report. The mysterious sulfidation is documented by the New York Times as perhaps the deepest mystery uncovered in the investigation. Where did the sulfur come from? They don't know. Even structural engineer Abolhassan Astani Azal, who had unlimited access to the Fresh Kills landfill, documents this attack on the girder, which he says he saw and documented, of course, at the collapse at the bottom of the debris pile in Building 7. And to look at this phenomena more carefully, we're going to turn to experiment. And John Cole, no less than any other, has done some very important experiments for us. He's the owner of his own civil engineering firm, 30 years of experience in construction management, bridge, utility, and infrastructure design. Please welcome John Cole from Sarasota, Florida.
Well, thank you. Thank you for allowing me to speak here. Experiment is really the core of the scientific method. It's really the key to science. When you make a hypothesis, you must be able to back it up and either prove it through real-world experiments or real happenings that we see with other events. An experiment cannot be replaced with computer models or mathematics unless that mathematics and computer models are confirmed by experiment. So what I tried to do is I looked at several different issues on 9/11, and through the years put together a series of experiments to either confirm or prove wrong various hypotheses. And so if we can go to the next slide, please. Okay, so my first experiment is I wanted to test a claim that was made regarding that sulfur. Dr. Stephen Jones was just mentioned that there was a strange sulfur that was found in eutectic formations that came from the gypsum drywall. The claim was from the BBC, since nobody could answer it and NIST never addressed it, that the gypsum came from, that the sulfur came from gypsum drywall. And I think on the next slide, this is what we were told by the mainstream experts. Well, the BBC made a statement that the sulfur came from the gypsum drywall that stewed in the pile for weeks. So they never put together an experiment. So I put together an experiment where basically I took a steel column or a steel beam and I wrapped it with gypsum and I burned it for several hours in the fire. Here it is right here. Then I removed the gypsum and I removed everything after it stewed, and there was no intergranular deformations, no thinning of it. It was still solid and sound. So by experiment, we're proving that the gypsum drywall was not the source of the sulfur. It had to be some other source. So that's just that's the first experiment. Okay, yeah. As was pointed out earlier today, there were several different claims on how those towers came down. The first claim was a pancake type collapse, and the second claim was a pile driver type collapse. So one of the ways we can test this theory is either to compare it to real world other buildings that came down, or to make our own experiments to see if we can get the similar motions as far as the pancake or the pile driver collapse. And so I ran some experiments. This is what we were told by the PBS and the NOVA program. That hit play. We were
failed.
bas-
The floors they were holding cascade down with a force too great to be withstood. The result is what's called a progressive collapse, as each floor pancakes down onto the one below.
Now, what they forgot to do is continue to keep going here. We noticed quite a bit of the core column still there. I decided again to run my own experiments. This was some pancake type experiments, and in every experiment I ran, this is just one example, the falling object always decelerated or slowed down, and so I could not support the pancake theory of collapse. Next, Richard. So, and even NIST came out later on, and they said that they do not support the pancake theory of collapse. They said that in 2011. So what NIST did, although they stopped their study at collapse initiation, they endorsed the Besant pile driver collapse. And like the pancake collapse, the sequence of forces that we are observing here had to be first down from gravity, and then any outward motion had to come later. So the sequence of forces with either theory was down first and then out. So again, I wanted to run some experiments. Here's an experiment with a falling object. This is a pancake, and every time, this is just one example, that I ran this, the top section would always decelerate. It would never accelerate. And even when I used some paper walls, I tried to make my little experiments as weak as possible. Even then, there was still no acceleration. It was always a deceleration in every time that I did that, and there was no crush down, crush up. Now, the controlled demolition theory, unlike the pancake and the pile driver theories, the sequence of forces are now reversed. Instead of being down by gravity and then out, really what we're saying is the forces were first out, and then it allowed the gravitational acceleration down. So it was out then down. So if we experiment with some explosives, I put some firecrackers in some towers, set them up, and this is what happened. And if we take a look at this, we see that the upward motion was outward first and then down. Now with the towers, they were also out and down motions. Let's see if they're similar. So if we do a side-by-side comparison here, and we observe the motions. And again, we see that spire in the middle that did not come down. And we observe the motion of the top stories. They're uniform and they're relatively smooth. There is no impact. And this may be why they were unable to provide a full explanation of the total collapse.
Thank you, John Cole, civil engineer, Sarasota, Florida.